Hello everyone, this is Mr. Schultz, and this is AP Biology video 1.2. This video will cover biochem basics, carbohydrates, and lipids. This video is going to cover the sections 3.1 through 3.4 of the Biology in Focus textbook. So let's get started. Organic compounds are compounds containing carbon. Okay, so any compound containing carbon is considered an organic compound for the most part. There's a few exceptions. Now, there are four main types of organic compounds: carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids. Of these four, three are considered what are called macromolecules because of their very large size. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that at length both in this video and right now, actually. So let's take a look. Carbohydrates are things like sugars, and their monomer or subunit, their basic part, is called a monosaccharide. Monosaccharides get put together to make what are called polymers. In this case, an example would be like starch. And then they help make up things like starches would help with cellular structure, so we might see them in granules in the chloroplasts. Nucleic acids, which is what DNA and RNA are made out of, their monomers are nucleotides, and you might find them as part of a chromosome. Proteins are made up of monomers called amino acids. There's a bunch of different kinds. We'll get to those in our protein video. They make up polypeptides, which are then folded to make proteins. So an example might be an intermediate filament. And then finally, the fatty acids make up a lipid. Lipids are kind of weird. They don't make bigger structures per se. They're generally not considered macromolecules because their size stays relatively small. And you might find them in something like an adipose cell, which is technically a fat storage cell inside of the body. So let's talk about carbon, because that's the big player in all organic chemistry. Carbon only has 4 of its 8 valence electrons filled, which means that it has 4 electrons available for bonding. This makes carbon incredibly versatile because it means that it can bond with multiple different other elements, or it can bond with any number of other elements multiple times. So like carbon dioxide, carbon can bond with 2 oxygen molecules, making 2 double bonds. Carbon will share electrons with 2 or more molecules. An example, again, carbon dioxide. Carbon has 4 valence electrons. Oxygen's got 2. So the 2 get shared between a carbon and an oxygen. Well, there's 2 more electrons available, so another oxygen just kind of plops in. Carbon skeletons can vary in 4 different ways. So when we talk about carbon skeletons, what we're talking about are carbons that are bonded to other carbons with other things bonded around them. And so they can vary in length from 1 carbon molecule, which might be something like methane, to 2, which would be like ethane, and so on and so forth. And they can get really long. They can branch, where you have, in an example here, we have 2-methylpropane, which is a branched carbon skeleton. You can have double bonding, so butene, 1-butene, and 2-butene, you see these little, they're kind of hard to see, there's little double bonds between the carbons. And then finally, there's also the presence of rings. So benzene is an example of a ring in carbon. Another ring would be like glucose is a ring, but it's also got some other stuff going on. Hydrocarbons are going to be molecules that form from just carbon and hydrogen. So like ethane and propane are hydrocarbons. They're only carbon and hydrogen. Methane's another example of that. These burn really well as part of their properties. But just understand that if you see a hydrocarbon, it's just carbon and hydrogen. There's nothing else involved. Now, in organic chemistry, we have these things called chemical groups. They're specific little pieces that are sometimes found in specific molecules. So a chemical group is any hydrogen can be replaced with a different chemical group on the chain. So if you've got like 2 carbons and there's just hydrogens around, you can pull a hydrogen off and add a group, and it'll change the properties of that molecule. This can change both the shape and the function of the macromolecule itself. And you can do lots of different variations. Organic chemistry is incredibly complex with many, many different molecules. Functional groups are a chemical group that changes how the molecule reacts chemically. And there's a number of important functional groups that you'll have to be aware of, and some that you will just need to know what they are. A hydroxyl group, which is an OH group, generally makes an alcohol. So ethanol would be C2H5OH. and that would be an example of ethanol. It's the actual alcohol that's found in alcoholic beverages. A carbonyl group, which is found in ketone and aldehyde, acetones, things like that. Carbonyl groups, you're probably not going to need to know too well in AP biology, but you'll need to be able to recognize that sometimes they do pop up. A carboxyl group, which is found in carboxylic acids and organic acids, like an acetic acid, is an example of a carboxyl group. Amines, which are really important because they're part of what make up amino acids, is just an NH3 or an NH2 chemical group. So that one you will need to know. A sulfhydryl group or sulfhydryl group, you probably won't need to know that one too much. Phosphate groups you will need to know for ATP. It's a phosphate with 4 oxygens. And then methyl groups, which are CH3 groups. Methyl groups come into play, are particularly important in DNA and proteins being turned on and off. There are what's called methylations, which is part of genetics. So let's talk about one specific compound that's really important. We're going to talk about this in much more detail later in the year, but it's important to know of its existence and what it does. And that's ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. ATP provides energy for the cell to use during chemical reactions. It contains an adenosine molecule, which is down here, along with 3 phosphate groups. Now, what happens with ATP is one of the phosphate groups, because there's a lot of energy between these bonds that kind of make it very unstable. When it breaks off, it doesn't actually release energy. When it breaks off, that phosphate attaches to something else, and it brings energy with it, which then transfers to the other molecule, which causes the molecule to change shape or cause a chemical reaction to take place. So ATP is really important. We like to think of them as like a charged battery, and then when we need to use them, we use up the energy in them and they become a dead battery. But like a rechargeable battery, we can actually recharge ATP by adding the phosphate back to ADP, and it creates the energy molecule again. And there's a whole process for this. This is what respiration does. It makes ATP. It's what mitochondria do. The powerhouse of the cell makes more ATP for the cell to use because it's used everywhere, and it's incredibly important. Macromolecules are going to be molecules that are made up of smaller parts. And what we call them, the specific term is called a polymer. Poly means many. So long molecules consisting of many similar or identical building blocks linked by covalent bonds. They could be identical, where we use the same thing over and over again, but many times they're different parts. So like in the example of DNA, there are 4 different base pairs, but depending on the order they're in changes the gene. Monomers are simply just the repeating units that make up the polymer. So monomers are the little building blocks that make the longer chain. Sometimes it's easy to think of monomers as being like beads, and polymers being like a bracelet that you make with a bunch of beads in a row. Carbohydrates, proteins, and nucleic acids are all polymers. Lipids are not. So when you look at a lipid, it's technically not a macromolecule because it isn't made of many little pieces over and over again. It's not a chain. It's like a couple of small pieces put together, but they never really make bigger pieces. Now, to make polymers, synthesizing, which is another word for making, okay, this is a word that a lot of students struggle with because they don't really know what it means. Synthesizing means to make. To synthesize polymers, monomers are connected together using enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that control chemical reactions in the cell. Enzymes are molecules that speed up chemical reactions. They're basically like a catalyst that the cell actually makes. Most enzymes are probably going to be proteins. Some of them are RNA as well. Monomers are connected together via dehydration synthesis. It's a chemical reaction in which we pull a water molecule out of the 2 monomers to stick them together. So when 2 monomers are connected, a water molecule gets pulled out. One monomer provides the hydroxyl group, the OH group, while the other monomer provides a hydrogen group. And these have to be done in a specific way. So the monomers have to line up in a very specific way. Otherwise, this reaction doesn't take place. Polymers can be pulled apart by hydrolysis, which is the opposite of dehydration synthesis. We add a water to the polymer to help break them down, and enzymes do this as well. So enzymes do all sorts of reactions. They're really important. An example would be our digestive system has enzymes that break down bigger sugars into smaller sugars so our bodies can absorb them and then pass them to the parts of the body that need them right away. An example or a visual of dehydration synthesis, and this works with any monomers that are being built together to make polymers, is what we do is we line up our glucose, so we're going to use carbohydrates for this. We line up a glucose, and then we line up a glucose in the same way. And so a hydroxyl group is going to get pulled off of one, hydrogen on the other, and they get attached together. This does not automatically happen. Enzymes are required because this requires energy to do this reaction. And so if we put two glucose molecules together, we get a maltose and a water molecule. It's not uncommon for the AP test to give you two monomers and ask you which of the following is the polymer, or show the reaction or pick the reaction that works correctly for dehydration synthesis. So just be aware that you will be asked to know how this works and how they line up, whether it's two carbohydrates or more than likely two amino acids is the more common one. So why is there so much diversity in organic chemistry? There are literally thousands upon thousands of different organic molecules, and our bodies don't make all of them. Some of them are made in other plants and fungi and other things that we don't make, but they're really important. There are only actually about 40 to 50 monomers across all the biomolecules. But what's really interesting is because there's a big diversity of them, monomers, like let's take amino acids. There are 20 essential amino acids. If you change the order and the number of different amino acids, it completely changes the structure of the polymer, which is a protein. So the more close, and the thing is, when we look at evolution of macromolecules and relatedness between organisms, we can actually look at an organism's DNA and proteins. The more similar DNA is between one organism of one species and the organism of another species tells us that they're more closely related. An example of this is if we compare the DNA of humans and chimpanzees with that of humans and horses, our DNA is more similar to a chimpanzee than it is to a horse. It tells us we're more closely related to one another. And we can do the same thing with protein structure as well. We can look at the amino acid sequences, the long polymers of amino acids in a protein, and we can compare the similarities and differences. And depending on how similar they are, we can guess how closely related they are. So, let's talk a little bit about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are generally sugars and the polymers of sugars. The monosaccharides are going to be your monomers of the sugars. Monosaccharides means single sugars. They generally have some multiple of CH2O. So an example would be glucose is C6H12O6. And most come with either 3, 5, or 6 carbons. A 3-carbon sugar is called a triose. A 5-carbon sugar is a pentose. An example of this is in DNA and RNA. Okay, and then 6 carbons, which are hexoses, which is a lot of like our food sugars. Most sugars end in ose. So if you see a word that ends in ose, there's a good chance it's a sugar of some kind. So keep that in mind, or a carbohydrate. Disaccharides are 2 monosaccharides that are joined together by what's called a glycosidic linkage. Anytime you have 2 carbohydrates or more connected together, they form glycosidic linkages. Sucrose is an example, where sucrose is a glucose and a glucose and a fructose bonded together. Now the actual reaction is through dehydration synthesis, but the link or the bond is called a glycosidic linkage. Plants generally transport carbs or carbohydrates as sucrose. So that's why we get a lot of our sugar from like cane sugar. It's actually from cane plants that make this sucrose. Other examples of disaccharides are lactose and maltose. Lactose is a sugar found in milk. If you're lactose intolerant, you don't have the enzymes to break this sugar down, and your body purges it because it can't use it. And then maltose is a sugar also found in things like alcoholic beverages. So, Polysaccharides are polymers with hundreds or thousands of sugars joined together by glycosidic linkage. And I'm going to move my head a little bit for this one. So some examples would be like starch. Starch is glucose monomers stored in plants, and it allows the plants to stockpile surplus sugar. Plants go through photosynthesis, and they make lots of sugars, and they don't need all of them right away. So they'll generally store them in places and create starch. An example of a starchy plant product is a potato. Potatoes are full of starches because the potato plants don't need all of their starches, so they store them in their roots for later use. And here's an example of a picture of starch. It's kind of branched. It's not overly messy. Its structure is very basic, and that allows the plant to break down the sugars much easier. Glycogen is a polymer of glucose used by animals for storage, and it's stored in the liver and muscles. And the reason for that is the liver is a major storage place for carbs in our body. Our sugars go through there, and if we need more sugar, our body releases chemicals that signal for, hey, we need more sugar, and so sugar gets released into the blood. The reason muscles have it is because muscles just use a lot of sugar to make a lot of ATP, and that's part of cellular respiration. Cellulose is the tough part of plant cells, or cell walls in plants, and it's also known as fiber to us and other animals. So cellulose is generally undigestible for our bodies. And so what happens is the cellulose goes into our digestive system, and because it can't be broken down, mucus is formed around it, which actually is what helps you poop. That's why they say eat fiber, because it helps with digestive issues. Some organisms can break down cellulose, but it requires lots of enzymes and oftentimes requires bacterial microbes in your gut. So like cows have multiple stomachs to help break down these sugars that would otherwise not be available when they're eating grass. The last example of a polysaccharide that I want to mention, I got this cool little GIF here, or GIF, depending on who you are, is a carbohydrate called chitin, and it's used by arthropods to build their exoskeletons. It's also used to build cell walls in fungi. So if you're a cicada, and cicadas are really cool and kind of ugly, their outside skin is their skeleton, and it helps hold their body together. And as insects grow larger and larger, they have to shed their skin in order for them to increase in size. So what you'll see is they'll shed their skin, and over the next maybe minutes to hours, their body has to reharden. So the chitin has to reform and reharden around them. So if you've ever seen like a butterfly hatch, it takes a few minutes to a while for the butterfly to be able to fly off. So, and cicadas are cool, by the way. If you ever want to look up a really cool insect, cicadas are fantastically amazing. So by all means, look them up. They're really neat. They're also ugly, which kind of makes them cool too. Now, the other biomolecule I want to talk about today is lipids. Lipids are organic compounds that don't mix well with water and are not considered macromolecules. Their structure isn't complex enough to be a macromolecule. Now, fats are constructed from a glycerol and fatty acids. So here's a glycerol molecule right here, and these are the fatty acids. And depending on the fatty acids determines what kind of fat you get. So the fatty acids are just long carbon skeletons with a carboxyl group at the end. So here's our carboxyl group right here. Generally, their nonpolar carbon-hydrogen bonds make it really hydrophobic. Fats do not like water. Okay. Now, there are two types of fatty acids to be aware of for fats. The first is saturated fatty acids. In a saturated fatty acid, the structure is saturated. It's filled with hydrogen molecules, and there are no double bonds. So here's an example of a saturated fatty acid. All these carbons have hydrogens, and there are no double bonds. In unsaturated fats, the structure has double bonds that create kinks in the fatty acid structure, and these kinks change the structure of the fats. And what this does is it creates two different kinds of fats. Saturated fatty acids are generally found in animal fats. So if you're eating bacon, that's full of saturated fat. And unsaturated fats are generally oils. They're liquids at room temperature, whereas saturated fats are solids. Unsaturated fatty acids are things like olive oil and vegetable oil and things like that. They're generally considered more healthy than saturated fats, but fats can be eaten in moderation for both kinds, and you should be okay. Now, phospholipids are a type of lipid, and they're a special kind of lipid in that they have one glycerol, they have two fatty acids, but their last fatty acid group, instead of being a fatty acid, is a phosphate group. Phosphates are charged molecules, so they actually create a polar part to this lipid. And so one side is hydrophobic, that would be the fatty acid tails, because it's all carbon and hydrogen, they don't like water. And the phospholipid, the phosphate at the top, actually is hydrophilic. And so it likes water. And so what's going to happen is when you put a bunch of phospholipids in water, the tails all come together and form a barrier, while the heads stick on the outside, and they create this area that likes water. And so it just naturally forms a shell. Phospholipids are the major component of the cell membrane. And the heads stick outward and the tails push inward. And we'll talk even more about this when we talk about the fluid mosaic model during the cell unit. Steroids are also another type of lipid. They're lipids that are characterized by a carbon skeleton consisting of 4 fused rings of carbon. And the chemical groups that are attached determine the steroid's properties. So there's a general structure to a steroid, and then all the stuff that gets attached to it determines what the steroid actually does. Steroids are generally used for signaling molecules, and they're usually made up of originally from cholesterol. So cholesterol is an essential part of the cell membrane. It helps hold the membrane together and keep it fluid, but it's a precursor to steroids made by the body. They're generally, cholesterol is made in the liver or from your diet. So like your body can make cholesterol on its own, but we also get some from our diet. You have to be careful with cholesterol. There are different kinds. There's cholesterol you get from like red meats that's not good for you. And then there's cholesterol that comes from like fish and olive oil and things like that that are much healthier for you. Sometimes tree nuts have it too. And your levels of cholesterol determine your health. So in years past, I've been told that my cholesterol numbers were bad. So what I did is I changed my diet to eat more fish and nuts. And that allowed me to change the number of fatty acids I have in my body, which will reduce the risk of things like a heart attack and other issues that cholesterol cause, like clotting of your arteries. Now, saturated fats can cause high levels of cholesterol, which is called atherosclerosis, which is the clogging of your arteries, which is why you want to avoid eating at like Culver's and McDonald's every day, because it's high in cholesterol. But cholesterol is not necessarily a bad thing. We use it to make steroids and other things, like it's used in our cell membranes. So sometimes too much of something is a bad thing, but in this case, we still need some of it. This is the end of this video. Our next video will be looking at another type of macromolecule.